The labor of scholarship is positively daunting. Mountains of literature spanning thousands of years in obscure languages hidden away in virtually every corner of the earth. Hours upon hours spent bent over fragmented manuscripts, puzzling them back together, hoping for some meaning to emerge. And often only with tremendous effort, something like a comprehensible text emerges if you're highly skilled and very lucky. Atop all that, the skills at time management, the need for laser focused concentration and attention, the intelligence and wit to render any of that comprehensible, especially to a wider non-specialist audience, even more challenging. And finally, the enormous memory required to hold this vast, interconnected web into a singular intellectual totality. It's simply unsurprising that most are just happy to dip their toes in rather than dive into the world of scholarship. It's just that intimidating. And that was true in the ancient world just as much as now. Maybe even more so. But what if there were a means, a magical means, to acquire vast libraries of knowledge, have one's memory infinitely expanded, and even gain access to the fundamental secrets of reality itself? Emerging in the centuries prior to the turn of the first millennia, just such a magical technology developed at the periphery of the world of rabbinical Judaism. This magic involved extreme fasting, meticulous ritual purity, and complex magical code words of power by which an angel known as the Sar Torah, or the Prince of the Torah, was drawn down from the Celestial Academy to instantly bequeath learning, memory, and esoteric wisdom upon the pure seeker. But of course, such a procedure came with extreme peril. The angelic beings invoked were known for their absolute ferocity, and one mistake could leave them to lash out, dissolving the impure seeker into a puddle of their own bile. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content on topics in esotericism, including curated playlists. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics like these, topics almost unavailable online, I'd hope you consider supporting my work over at Patreon with a one-time donation, perhaps with PayPal, with the super thanks options that you can find just below the video, or you can pick up some of our merch over at the store tab on the channel. But now, let's turn to the magical invocation of the Sar Torah, the Prince of the Torah, and the promise of intellection beyond words, memory without end, and wisdom hidden away in the treasure houses of the divine. I'm Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The world of ancient Jewish learning and traditional learning more generally is just radically different from our own contemporary educational values. As you may know, truly Jewish literature began with the Mishnah, and it grew out of an existential threat to Judaism itself. Following a series of disastrous civil wars and insurrections against imperial colonization, and the subsequent genocide in Judea following the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Jewish intellectual life was just simply near the brink of extinction. As part of a last-ditch effort to preserve Judaism, especially the oral traditions, which were at the core of how Judaism was practiced, really at the core of how all religions are practiced, Lived religion, many of which are, of course, oral traditions, are the Torah Shebaal Peh, were for the first time edited and written down together sometime around 200 of the Common Era. That collection became known as the Mishnah. Subsequent generations, of course, further elaborated on the Mishnah because it's a incredibly technical and terse text, and the resulting commentary conversation literature became the two Talmuds. Yes, two Talmuds. The Jerusalem Talmud, which was completed around 400 of the Common Era, and the Babylonian Talmud, completed around 500 in the Common Era in the Sasanian Empire. Further literature would also emerge such that by the 7th and 8th centuries, Judaism was truly a religion of books, represented by dozens, if not hundreds, of volumes in a wide variety of language of an extremely high degree of technical detail. After all, commandments by the divine to, for instance, to not work on the Sabbath, these were under the threat of execution, which meant that they were incredibly important, and that meant precisely determining what constituted work and when exactly the Sabbath began and ended. That wasn't just trivia, they were core to the covenantal relationship between Israel and their God, and they weren't really spelled out in the Torah. So the Torah doesn't interpret itself, so someone has to do the interpretation. And as you can imagine, at the very heart of the rabbinical curriculum was reading, rereading, debating, and committing those texts to memory in as precise detail as possible. Whereas contemporary educational systems value things like creativity and critical thinking and experimentation, well, at least they say they value those things. Your mileage may vary. Classical education was primarily set upon a foundation of appeal to ancient authorities, formal adherence to laws of inference, such as those found in logic, and committing as much to memory as possible. Such traditional forms of education still exist in the world and are actually remarkably similar, from Buddhists to Muslims to Jews in the yeshiva, and these shared values, especially the value placed on rote memorization. Of course, in an era where books were extremely expensive and language was thought to be divine, it should be of no surprise that memory becomes the central store of a community's wisdom. It's what's in the mind of scholars that matters, less what's in books. In fact, those books rely on what's in the minds of scholars. However, when seeing the mountain of literature of any religion or wisdom tradition, the immediate problem confronts us. How does one memorize such vast libraries? How do you hold that wisdom in memory and then express it to new adepts and subsequent generations? Most people these days, they hardly have their loved ones' phone numbers memorized. You don't even know your parents' number half the time, much less the Quran and the Hadith, the Tripitaka, the Torah and the Mishnah, any collection of vast memorized literature. Of course, a wide variety of techniques emerged through the centuries to aid in this memorization, and among different communities that allowed the art of memory to flourish, from far off lands all the way down to what's near and dear to us with things like mnemonic devices, the memory palaces of the Middle Ages. You could encode that knowledge in song and poetry and chant like the Quran, and of course just endless hours of practice. The treasuries of memory were positively full in centuries past. And they still are in traditional communities. Just not so much us. We haven't really taken Thoth's prophecy to heart. Of course, that's all hella hard work, and I suspect that if one could find a technological shortcut to gaining wisdom, storing it in memory, and using it in, miraculous ways, many would do so. I would do so. And surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, magical techniques were developed for just such a task. Of course they were. Now, I've covered a medieval European form of magical knowledge and memory acquisition in the form of the notorious, famous text known as the Ars Notoria in another episode. You can check that out in the card above if you're interested in learning about staring at cool sigils using angels to get you knowledge of the liberal arts. But in this episode, I want to turn to a specifically Jewish angelic form of conjuration in which the vast knowledge of the Torah was instantly accessible, memory was expanded, and the recipient was given supernatural powers. Because, of course, it's magic. This magical system, as much as it is one system, is known to scholars as the praxis of the Sar Torah, or the Prince of the Torah. So, first and foremost, where do we find the literature of the Sar Torah praxis? Well, it's largely embedded in the mystical literature known to scholars now as Hekhalot or Merkavah mysticism, in magical manuals recovered from hidden storehouses of sacred literature found in Islamic lands primarily. But before we move on to the Sar Torah mysticism, or magic rather, let's say a little bit more about these sources where it's found. So Merkavah, which literally means chariot, or Hekhalot, which literally means palaces or temples, was a school of mystical praxis that emerged sometime in the late classical world and focused on the Jewish adepts' quasi-shamanic journey into the divine realm. This journey, which was usually a descent in the literature rather than ascent, Yordei Merkavah, the descenders to the chariot, would plunge the adept into a perilous adventure beset with illusion tests and fierce angelic guardians, which could only be bypassed through the use of magical passcodes and ritual purity, because it's somehow a D&D adventure in the late classical world. If successful, however, the adept would gain entrance to the throne room of the divine, often conceived as the chariot from the famed Ezekiel vision. This vision would impart supernatural wisdom. It could transform the adept into a fiery angelic being. Allegedly, Enoch is transformed into Metatron using techniques like this. Or it would actually allow the adept to join in the inner worship of the divine with the heavenly choir and also somehow transform them. This literature survives, is incredibly complex, and scholars frankly are still struggling to fully understand how it and rabbinical Judaism developed alongside each other, and maybe even its relationship to early Christianity. I've done an episode on Paul and his possible relationship to all this. Now, I've also done an early episode on the channel on Merkavah Hekhalot-Literatur as well. I kind of want to remake it because I think it's not that great. But it's still a decent start if you want to introduce yourself to the world of late classical Jewish shamanism. However, the Sar Torah magical praxis as we have it today is actually largely embedded into this Merkavah Hekhalot literature, sometimes in a haphazard and frankly puzzling manner at times. And while the two did develop perhaps in similar milieus and even sometimes cross-pollinate, they're kind of ironically coupled in at least one key respect. Merkavah mysticism was a journey to the divine realm by the practitioner, whereas the Sar Torah praxis was meant to pull down, to invoke an angel to travel down to the adept out of the divine realm. So, at least in this way, they make for a bit of an odd combination in the very mystical literature itself. The second location we find Sar Torah texts are in storehouses of sacred literature known as Genizah, Genizot. You may know that any text with Hebrew sacred names on it can't simply be thrown away, rather they have to be collected and then ritually buried. Now, lucky for us and archaeologists, some of those storage rooms full of text actually just went unburied for centuries. Sometimes they went unburied for 1,000+ years and have yielded real treasures of historical Jewish literature and random fragments of things. Though, again, this is often just a pile of things. One of those treasures, however, to be received has been Jewish manuals of magic, otherwise utterly unknown from other literature. They wouldn't have survived basically at all, except for them being put in one of these genizahs. I've made an episode on one of the more important texts that have been reconstructed from fragments found in the Ibn Ezra synagogue in Cairo, which, by the way, just got reopened this week for tourists, so go visit the Ibn Ezra synagogue. That text is known as Sefer HaRazim, or the Book of Secrets, and you can learn more about it in the card above. There's some cool things in there about how to learn to use magic to win horse races. But some of those fragments also contained especially interesting ritual texts from the Sar Torah practice, preserved primarily in Aramaic. Finally, it's worth noting that such a magical praxis, or really any magical praxis, doesn't emerge out of a vacuum. It's not like Jewish magic is exclusively Jewish. Magic is almost by definition syncretistic. A handful of magical spells for gaining wisdom or foreknowledge and improving one's memory and wisdom also appear in the Greek magical papyri, the group of literature most adjacent to the kind of magical literature we're talking about here. Interestingly enough, 3 of 4 of the spells come from PGM-4, the so-called Great Paris Magic Manual. These spells and practices, while not perfectly mirroring the Sar Torah practice, so they do share some similarities, though those are probably just reflective of the general Eastern Mediterranean ritual practices of that time, rather than any close genetic relationship, frankly. Further, another handful of Jewish magical texts from the early Middle Ages also survive, and they probably date back to the late Classical period, around the same time that the Sar Torah literature began to develop, and these are known as Petichat Lev, or opening the heart rituals. These typically involve saying very specific incantations over the wine used for Havdalah, the ceremony for transitioning from the Sabbath to the rest of the week. Now, these incantations, which employ things like angelic names or psalms or kind of psalm-like literature, are actually said over the Havdalah wine in order to facilitate further Torah learning for a general increase in wisdom or to prevent memory loss. Conversely, other spells in this same genre are also something like exorcistic-like incantations aimed at the demon of forgetfulness. Potah. Yes, you can blame Potah if you've ever forgotten anything. It's not your fault you failed the quiz, it's Potah's. Though, as we'll see, both these brief Petichat Lev incantations are ritually and narratively distinct from the Sar Torah magical tradition, and they probably represent another minor but distinct tradition for accomplishing similar ends. I mean, people use whatever technology they can get their hands on to expand their memory and their wisdom. Finally, embedded in the Sar Torah literature are pericopes, which also mention an angel called the Sar HaPanim, or the Prince of the Presence. This is a very important angel known from other sources outside of this literature as well. In fact, in the Book of Jubilees, it's rather prominent. As this episode is going to get pretty involved, frankly, I'm going to hold back my discussion of the Sar HaPanim, who seems to function a bit like the Sar Torah in this literature and may have been the same being in the minds of these writers for whatever reason, but it's worth pointing out that the Sar HaPanim is so interesting and distinct that he's going to have to be a topic for another day. They will have to be a topic for another day. Though, again, magical spells in the Greek magical papyri and in Jewish magic more broadly shouldn't be ignored, and we have to understand the Sar Torah literature in that cultural and historical framework. But now, finally, let's turn to the narrative and the praxis of the Sar Torah magic. It's useful but not totally accurate to separate the Sar Torah magical practice into narrative and ritual texts. Why? Because narrative texts often contain ritual elements, and some ritual texts do contain some narrative, so it isn't a perfect distinction. Further, there are at least 2 distinct Sar Torah narratives whereby the ritual itself is framed. As I mentioned, these texts are peppered throughout the Merkavah literature and other magical literature, and it's clear that by the time they come to be housed in that literature, they were already, they were distinct though, quite related to the Merkavah literature. They were quite textually fluid, composed probably of smaller textual units called microforms that were edited together to form what we call macroforms in various recensions, and none of the narratives are ritual texts totally or coherent, which is just frankly normal for magical textbooks. Magical texts aren't strictly textbooks to be followed 100% the way that you would maybe a geometry textbook, but they're a baseline for experimentation, and ritual and textual uniformity is frankly the exception rather than the rule. These are the ground floor for experimentation, which gets reflected in future manuscripts. However, like the Merkavah literature, the narrative sections typically focus on rabbinical heroes, especially Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi Nechunya, and Rabbi Akiva. These are all famed scholars from the period of the Tanaim, the period of the folks that composed the Mishnah, and they were all central and truly heroic in the Merkavah mysticism, especially Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael. As you may know, Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana has actually become the big deal in Kabbalah as the author, allegedly, of the Schäfer Bahir. Now, in one group of those narrative sections, we're told that the youthful Rabbi Ishmael had difficulties in his studies. I'm sure we can all sympathize, especially in his memorization of Scripture and the Mishnah. Now, in an attempt to fix this, he actually subjected himself to a range of deeply ascetic practices, probably in hopes of zeroing in on his intellectual labor, not to be distracted. Now, seeing that kind of dedication, Rabbi Nechunya actually brings that youth, Rabbi Ishmael, into the chamber of hewn stone. This is within the temple's precincts and actually the location for the meeting of the Sanhedrin, the most important religious body in Israel. Here, Rabbi Ishmael swears secret invocation using various esoteric names of the mysterious angel Metatron, such that he's instantaneously given both exo and esoteric knowledge of the Torah and a watertight memory, never to forget those sacred teachings ever again. Indeed, this short narrative ends such that Rabbi Ishmael intends to teach this praxis to all of Israel to increase their wisdom and memory. He wants to teach it to everyone. There's a real democratization of knowledge in this magical literature. To this basic narrative, we find significant expansions, especially on the esoteric names used in the rituals, the various attendant angels that are involved, and even the details of the frankly terrifying encounter with the Sar Torah. By no means is this encounter like pleasant or beautiful. The Sar Torah, like other angels in Jewish tradition, are absolutely fearsome beings, more than capable and honestly more than keen on simply destroying human beings for bothering them. In fact, the Sar Torah actually refers to Rabbi Ishmael, who, by the way, had been spending plenty of time engaging in purification rituals in anticipation perhaps of this encounter. The Sar Torah refers to him as son of a stinking drop, worm and vermin. In another narrative, we actually might learn why the Sar Torah was so angry with him. In that narrative, rather than fulfilling the grueling 40-day fast to accomplish the ritual, Rabbi Ishmael cheats and attempts to invoke the Sar Torah only on day 12. Enraged, the Sar Torah was going to strike him down with great vengeance and furious anger, and at the last minute, Ishmael uses a magical word to kind of dispatch the Sar Torah back into heaven. Though, after 40 days, another angel, the Sar Hapanim, an ardently fierce angel of mercy and maybe fungible with the Sar Torah in this literature, again, the Sar Panim is going to get his own episode. He appears and reveals to Rabbi Ishmael a mysterious and powerful great seal and fierce crown. These are apparently two incredibly powerful magical words that appear in both Sar Torah literature and in the Merkavah mysticism. In another narrative, which seems to occur after Rabbi Ishmael has actually achieved his first Gnostic insight via the Sar Torah praxis, Rabbi Akiva sends the student back to his teacher to better learn the techniques involved. Why should be relatively apparent. Well, he intends to teach this to all of Israel, as we just mentioned a moment ago, but also he's only kind of done this once. He's an amateur at the Sar Torah praxis, and again, the stakes are pretty high here. The Sar Torah is not going to, entertain fools, and will just kill those who impiously invoke him. Specifically, the angel he melts people into a puddle of their own bile, as the text says. This is just a delightful image. They just get melted into their own bile. Now, the rest of the text are actually framed as teachings of the famous sage Akiva on the proper ritual praxis of the Sar Torah. As you may know, Akiva is known from both the Talmud in the famous section on the descenders to the Pardes, and in the Hekhalot-Literatur more generally, as the expert shaman-like character in descending to the throne of the divine. And this is where there is an interesting place where the literature of the Sar Torah and the literature of the Merkavah mysticism, in fact, overlap very strongly. In these instances, Akiva actually descends to the chariot, learns esoteric secrets, especially hymns, and having ascended safely, teaches those to his students in the text, and by extension, to us studying along. We get to learn along with the students of Rabbi Akiva. Specifically, these texts are punctuated, again, with more angelic and esoteric words of power, and important hymns to be uttered both in and to induce ecstatic states in the person undergoing the Sar Torah praxis. Now, the longest and most complex in the Sar Torah narratives is also, frankly, the most difficult to summarize. It's just sort of a long narrative at some level. Here we have a later discussion between Rabbi Ishmael again and Rabbi Akiva. Again, these are both heroes of Merkavah Hekhalot-Literatur on how that despite the fact that Shekhinah, or the divine presence, did not dwell in the second temple, that it was still the culmination of the glory of the Torah. How could that be the case? Well, we're told that during the building of the second temple, the Israelites, as they were inclined to do, rebuked God for the onerous condition of having to do all the physical labor of building the structure of the temple, but also from being commanded to simultaneously engage in the constant intellectual labor of studying the Torah. How can you do both? How can you build the thing and study the thing at the same time? God actually accepts this rebuke and offers to streamline the learning of the Torah into basically a one-day rapid revelation, a kind of second Moses theophany in some sense, if you want to imagine it like that, such that they can get on with building the temple. I mean, God needs the place to live after all. However, the chief prosecuting angel, a Satan-like character, although they're never called that, actually attempts to sway the divine from this miraculous intervention, arguing that human beings simply aren't worth the effort. This is a long-standing trope in Jewish literature, the angels arguing that human beings just were not worth it. This is probably true. I agree with the angels. However, God is determined to provide this boon, and the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, but not the Shekhinah, appears within the construction site of the temple and summons the shocked and dumbfounded Israelites, who are at that point knocked down on their faces, to rise and learn all the elements of Torah wisdom that day. The first to rise is the leader of the returned exiles, Zerubbabel, who begins to miraculously expound on the Torah. Now, from this narrative, Akiva, who has received the mystical tradition from both his mystical descendants, going back to Zerubbabel, all the way, and from his own rabbinical teachings, I'd say the teachings he's gotten from descending to the chariot himself, then expounds the dual praxis to Ishmael, and again, to us, studying along with the text. Now, we're going to come back to the praxis ritually in a moment, but the text continues with a kind of experiment. Will it work with non-experts? Yeah, they bring in an Am Haaretz, a Amcha, the rabbinical term for an unlearned country bumpkin. And they use the praxis with this Amcha, this bumpkin, and the bumpkin becomes equally equal to the teacher in learning. Ditto with a shepherd. Shepherd does the praxis illumination. Further, the praxis may only function in the land of Israel. So what do? Akiva goes all the way over to Babylon, and sure enough, the student, no matter how unlearned, becomes miraculously equal to their teacher, instantly using the Sar Torah praxis. These longer narrative sections also include further ritual directions, though they aren't exactly coherent from text to text. Remember, these texts are about experimentation, not so much about following them by rote. But you get the general drift of the narrative sections. Let's turn to what I know you're really interested in, the ritual stuff. Now, to be honest, the ritual elements are very difficult to summarize. I know I keep saying that, because again, they aren't totally coherent from text to text. It's hard to say what's this, because it's different from text to text. As I said earlier, magical texts are about experimentation rather than literary, and to my mind, what appears as a textual chaos for some scholars is actually just evidence of ritual praxis. This is just what we should expect in texts where people are experimenting ritually. But we can divide these practical ritual elements into two very specific issues that are clearly of central importance to the Sar Torah praxis: ritual and purity. First and foremost, there is just an assumption that the person performing this praxis is a religiously observant Jewish man, as many of the rituals piggyback. Is it kosher to piggyback on other daily Jewish rituals? And there is, as we will observe, a profound anxiety around ritual impurity, especially menstrual and nocturnal emissional seminal impurity. So again, the assumption here is that the one who's engaging in already thrice daily prayers and maintaining a kosher diet, they're observing the Sabbath, they're being religiously Jewish. However, atop that layer of religious life, which is already pretty inconvenient and strict, extra, even strenuous layers of ritual and ritual purity are imposed upon those wishing to attempt the Sar Torah praxis. Why? Why more? As I mentioned earlier, in Jewish mythologies, angels they're not exactly friendly to human beings. We are seen as filthy interlopers, hardly worthy of life, and definitely not worthy of, well, much else. I mean, the angels successfully argued that given everything human beings would do, we should have never been created in the first place, much less given the Torah. And the rabbis actually took a vote about this, and yeah, they agree with the angels. We should have never been created. Again, I kind of agree with them. You know that some lives are worth continuing, but none are probably worth starting. Further, they're just happy to see us dead. The angels are happy to strike us down if given the chance. So, on this thinking, if we're going to approach angels, if we're going to summon them, if we're going to go on adventures in the divine palaces where they are militantly guarding them and will kill us and shrink us, reduce us to puddles of bile, our only chance is to become as much like them as possible. So what does that entail? Angels don't eat, they don't engage in sex, they're ritually pure forever, and they don't smell of anything. Thus, much of the rituals of the Sar Torah praxis seem utterly unusual at first until you understand that they're basically you trying to undergo them by trying to pass as an angel. You're trying to become as much like an angel as possible to at least not offend them so they won't kill you once you've summoned them. So what does that entail? Well, firstly, it entails prayer. The angels ceaselessly pray in the divine court. Thus, these texts require near constant praying on the part of the practitioner. This involves prayers, chants, psalms, songs during the build-up to the central ritual. Now, many of these songs are actually included in the text and are unique to the Merkavah literature, some of which are actually been taken from secret songs uttered by the angels, recovered by the descender shamans like Akiva from the world of the Hekhalot. Many of those survive. Interestingly enough, some of those very songs from the Hekhalot-Literatur are still sung in the Jewish high holidays, although most people in the crowd would never know it. Again, remember, on Yom Kippur, the same be like an angel rules are in effect as well. Hence, it pairs well with this praxis, and some texts even line up the Sar Torah praxis with precisely the period of the high holidays, beginning in Elul and going through Simchat Torah. Now, one of the longer texts also prescribes that one study the Midrash of the Sar Torah. It's not clear what this text is, but it might just be the literature that we're reading itself, though, again, not terribly clear. Again, further following this logic, the angels don't eat. One's diet is radically altered through incredibly limiting fasts. Now, the lengths of these fasts range from 3 days to up to 40 days, of sometimes very strict all-day fasts up to dawn to nightfall fasts like you find in the minor fasts of Judaism, like a Ramadan fast. But these are highly restrictive nonetheless. Generally, the shorter the duration of the fast, the more intensely ascetic it becomes. So no wine, no meat, not even some vegetables, specifically onion, garlic, and garden vegetables are allowed. Can't have those. Why those vegetables? Well, they're associated with bad breath and flatulence during this time period in the literature, and they still are associated with that. And again, the angels don't smell like anything. We already reek to the angels just as clean as we can be. We smell terrible to them. Don't make matters worse by making stuff that'll make you fart around angels. So what can you eat? You can eat bread. And you can only eat bread that you make yourself. I'll come back on to why in a minute, why you can only eat the bread you make yourself. Further, the rituals involve multiple daily immersions in the mikveh, sometimes up to 24 immersions a day, one for each hour of the day, ensuring maximal ritual purity, again, like our angel buddies. Intense isolation is also required. For the period of the fast, one is required to sequester oneself as much as possible, usually alone in a room, preferably in an attic, actually. Barring that, one is forbidden to even look upon anyone in the street that they pass. In fact, you're not even allowed to look on the faces of babies or old people. Now, some modern occult practitioners might be getting hardcore Abramelin vibes at this point, and I'm also just struck by the similarities between the two. I've pointed this out in the past. It's possible that the Abramelin is a distant descendant of the Sar Torah praxis, but the link is admitted pretty tenuous, and I'm going to come back and do a video about this because I think it's intriguing. But further ritual purity is also enforced as well, specifically sexual and menstrual purity. While the Torah does mandate such purity rules, rabbinical law details that praxis to some degree. The Sar Torah praxis takes it much, much more strictly. Sexual activity of any kind is forbidden for between 3 and 40 days, probably mirroring the Mosaic preparation for the reception of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Any seminal emission, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, absolutely invalidates the previous fasting period, and the whole process has to begin again, similar to any menstrual contact of any kind. Now, recall the rules I said earlier about making your own bread and not looking in the face of those you might pass in the street? It's to ensure that your food has no possible contact with a menstruant and that you can't even gaze upon a menstruant. The gaze of a menstruant in this literature can cause you to have your own impurity. Now, this is a position that the rabbinical authorities had long rejected as overly strict, even superstitiously silly and overly pious. Despite that, the rabbinical authorities reject those techniques. They were apparently popular among people, and they even occur in the Talmud, where the gaze of a leper can actually cause you to have problems with your pregnancy, and they're found in incantation bowls of the time. Apparently, again, the gaze of twins, lepers, those with disqualifying discharges, or menstruants of any kind, were all thought to have a kind of contaminating effect through their gaze. Again, the ableism and misogyny is pretty rife here. One text even specifies that not only should one not even gaze at menstruants or people with, leprosy, you shouldn't even gaze at overly colorful clothing. You should focus only on the pure white garments of the practice alone. Once this state of angelic purity is accomplished, then and only then could one actually perform the praxis of the Sar Torah. The invocation of the Prince of the Torah, though often used through intermediary angelical beings through the use of magical words of power, often angelic names and permutations of the Tetragrammaton. The exact central magical device ranges from text to text, though often they do share some significant overlap. Specifically shared between the Sar Torah text and the Merkavah Hekhalot-Literatur is the use of what it calls the Great Seal and the Fearsome Crown. These are both words of power that are unique and otherwise unattested in any other magical literature, including the Greek magical papyri, or even Jewish magical texts like the Schäfer Harazim. And you guessed it, we have no idea what these words mean. They're utterly mysterious. Now, once performed, the Sar Torah, whose magical name, by the way, is now revealed, Yophiel, the beauty or pleasantness of God, though sometimes actually Metatron is the Sar Torah, will actually appear and magically impart a range of magical knowledge and properties to the adept. These include knowledge of the Torah as just a text specifically, but also Torah in the broadest sense of Chokhmah, wisdom. In fact, the Sar Torah is sometimes referred to as the Sar Chokhmah. Now, this is generally thought to include exoteric wisdom, knowledge of scripture, the rabbinical corpus such as the Mishnah and the Talmuds, of course, and the body of halakha or Jewish law, in addition to a wide range of other legal histories, including, again, most importantly, that whole expanded memory. You get like 5 gigs of memory. That's not very much anymore, is it? And intellectual skills to use such information. So you get the memory. That's a big deal. Again, there is a pronounced focus on being given a uniquely powerful and expansive memory, a core component of traditional education in these circles and still to this day. Now, having gained those elite rabbinical skills, one is then receives the power to act as a posek or a dayan. These are legal judges. They have the ability to make legally binding decisions for the community, such as to declare what is kosher and what is not. With such social power also comes elite social respect. Now you have a bunch of people respecting you, including the respect of the rich and the powerful, and you even gain an honorable name even in very distant lands, because I want an honorable name in distant lands. One's physical body is even transformed, becoming even more physically radiant and beautiful than before. Knowledge makes you hot. Of course, such knowledge makes one like an angel, and purely supernatural powers follow. These include being able to tame vicious animals, to quell the sea, to strike dead sinners, because that's what angels love to do. That's their hobby. And of course, you can revive those sinners if you so please. While these more outlandish claims are only represented in a minority of texts, they do align with the supernatural powers of Talmudic miracle workers like Choni the Circle Maker, or Chanina ben Doza and Shimon Bar Yochai, who had laser power eyes to destroy sinners. I've made another episode about these folks. They're called the Anshe Ma'aseh, or the men of miraculous deeds, if you want to check them out. Jesus was probably thought of by his Jewish contemporaries as one of these Anshe Ma'aseh people. However, at the core of the Sar Torah praxis is a reception of both exoteric Torah wisdom, but also esoteric Torah chokhmah, wisdom, for which the texts deploy a wide range of technical terms for various kinds of knowledge that must have meant something to the writers, but are now somewhat lost to us. They seem to all have, some valence. However, among these are certainly razim, or secrets, and setarim, or mysteries. These are probably concerned with Ma'aseh Bereshit, or cosmological questions about the nature and the origin of reality and how it'll all end, the end times, eschatological stuff, the fate of the soul and the afterlife, issues of theosophy in the inner realm of the divine, or Ma'aseh Merkavah. Again, this is a place where the two literatures and mysticisms overlap. The use of divine names for theurgical or quasi-magical use, all of which are more than hinted at in the text, but are never expounded upon at any length. We're told we'll get all these powers, but we're not told what they'll do exactly. Again, the goal of these texts were to inspire and inform the potential adept to undergo the Sar Torah praxis, to learn those secrets for themselves, not to reveal those secrets in those texts. The texts don't claim to contain such wisdom, only point the way to it, and maybe hopefully get you to study some of this stuff. So when, where, and by whom were these texts composed? Where did this magical praxis come from? Scholars are still unsure. I know you're surprised. Totally surprised. Internally, there isn't much to tip us off to a definitive answer to any of these questions. The emerging consent among scholars is that they were probably composed primarily in a Sasanian context, though it's equally possible that some of them were composed in Palestine, sometime in the centuries just after the completion of the Talmuds, but probably before, definitely before the turn of the first millennium, as they're actually mentioned around that time, especially by the 9th century Karaite scholar Salman bin Yaruchim. It's likely that this praxis, the Sar Torah praxis, reaches back centuries prior to that, but who composed them is equally mysterious. The text clearly relies on rabbinical knowledge, rabbinical values, and rabbinical characters, while eschewing traditional study and dialectic for this obviously more magical means to acquire Torah wisdom. Again, the emergent consensus is these texts were probably composed by non-elite rabbinical scholars because, the elite ones had already accomplished all the memorization and stuff. They didn't need magic to do that. Or they were prepared by para-rabbinical scholars, perhaps at the periphery of the great academies at Pumbedita and Sura in modern Iraq, near what is modern-day Fallujah. I think a helpful parallel here is the non-elite scholastics probably producing a great deal of the magical literature through the European Middle Ages, such as the Ars Notoria. Who else aside from students and teachers need to rapidly acquire the liberal arts, or our good friends over at the clerical necromantic underground. Obviously, again, these are priests in lower orders, typically exorcists. The composers of these texts clearly share the intellectual values of the rabbinical elite, but they're just as clearly willing to engage in what was probably likely heterodox means to achieve just that wisdom. Indeed, many of these tales developed in the narrative sections may have actually been written primarily to justify their Sar Torah praxis as in fact traditional. We've been doing this since the days of Moses, and Zerubbabel and Akiva did it, and Ishmael did it, just to counter charges they were engaged in heterodox, heretical shenanigans. Again, think of the use of Solomon to provenance medieval magical text, or even St. Thomas Aquinas to provenance alchemical text, despite the fact that he explicitly repudiated alchemy in his own works. It's weird when they attribute things to Thomas. The ultimate truth of the matter is that the people that compose these texts have well hidden themselves in history, and barring some new discovery, they're likely to remain hidden to us. What we have is the Sar Torah praxis in the mutilated and fragmentary form that it survives in, and we're lucky to have that. The Sar Torah magical praxis would ultimately survive primarily embedded in the Merkavah literature and would make its way to the wider Jewish world through the Middle Ages, though evidence for its practice as a discrete tradition is pretty hard to detect. It's not clear that anyone's engaging in it, at least by the Middle Ages. Perhaps by that time it was already assimilated into the Merkavah literature. It was maybe even then already passing into obscurity for reasons that we don't really understand. It's difficult, probably impossible to know, However, scholars in the past century or so have they have performed the important technical textual archaeology to unearth it from centuries of obscurity so that we can appreciate the history of this magical tradition. That said, it's still not terribly accessible even now. It remains little appreciated outside of a very small circle of specialists, hence Esoterica existing to try to get it out there a little bit. If you want to consult the critical, really synoptic edition of the text in the context of the Merkavah literature, good luck to you, my friends. It's in the Synopse Hekhalot-Literatur by Peter Schäfer, and it's basically impossible to find. At least in print. You can find it online. I've tried. And when you do find it, well, hope you got that Brill money. Brill money, baby. Speaking of Brill money, you can also find a central text of that. You can find the central text of the literature in Davila's Hekhalot-Literatur in translation. This is the most important English translation of the Hekhalot material. But yeah, from Brill. It's from Brill. So mortgage your house, sell your kids, or elect to become a high-risk mercenary. I hear they pay relatively well. You can get some Brill books through your murderousness. Don't do that. Though the good news is the best study of this material is in Schwartz's rather wonderful, it's a really fine piece of scholarship, his book Scholastic Magic, which you can get in the Princeton paperback reprints edition, which is still pretty expensive, honestly. It's $50 for a paperback print on demand. Really? Princeton? I mean, I know you don't got Harvard money, but still. Pulsa de Nora on these damn academic publishing cartels. That said, until next time, thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. And also we curse the academic publishing cartels.